What if the people you were told were the first ever to live in New Zealand were never really alone on those islands at all? What if the story written into textbooks, repeated by historians, and echoed for over 100 years, was never based on bones, never based on real evidence, and never based on science, but on something far more convenient for the people telling it? Before we go a single line further, do one small thing for me. Drop a heart on this video, subscribe to the channel with the bell turned on, and share it with someone in your life who still trusts the old version of this story. Because by the end of what I am about to share, you will not look at it the same way again, and someone you care about probably needs to hear it just as much as you did. We have to start with the story most of us grew up believing. It was tidy, it felt complete. It went something like this. The Maori were the first humans ever to set foot on New Zealand. They sailed across the open Pacific in giant ocean-going canoes, landed on an empty land, settled it, and lived there in total isolation for... Canoes landed on an empty land, settled it, and lived there in total isolation for hundreds of years before any other human being ever showed up. That is the paragraph you probably remember from school. That is the line you may have heard in a museum. That is the version that got reprinted in textbooks, year after year, decade after decade. It sounded clean, it sounded settled, it sounded finished. But real history is rarely finished. Real history is just the version that nobody has bothered to pry open yet. And underneath that clean paragraph lay a second story, a darker one, a story first, finished. Real history is just the version that nobody has bothered to pry open yet. And underneath that clean paragraph lay a second story, a darker one, a story first put into writing in the 1800s by European settlers, land surveyors, and colonial officials who were actively reshaping what it meant to live in New Zealand. That second story said something very different. It claimed the Maori were not the first people in the country at all. It claimed there was an older group, a gentler, quieter, more peaceful people, supposedly wiped out almost completely when the Maori canoes arrived. The story had a label that honestly should never have made it past a high school history fair. Some called supposedly wiped out almost completely when the Maori canoes arrived. The story had a label that honestly should never have made it past a high school history fair. Some called it the pre-Maori idea. Some linked it directly to a real community called the Moriori, who live on the cold, windswept Chatham Islands, roughly 800 kilometers east of the mainland. According to that older story, the Moriori were not relatives of the Maori at all. They were a separate, supposedly older race, the original people of New Zealand, a population that got displaced, forgotten, and largely erased. For more than 100 years, that story did not just sit quietly in obscure academic papers. It was printed in school. They were a separate, supposedly older race, the original people of New Zealand, a population that got displaced, forgotten, and largely erased. For more than 100 years, that story did not just sit quietly in obscure academic papers. It was printed in school, books. It was recited in classrooms. It was repeated by respected voices in newspapers and government reports. It shaped the way an entire country understood its own past. And it had consequences that stretched far beyond the pages of any history book. Because if you convince a population that the people already living on a piece of land once conquered and destroyed an even earlier people, you quietly plant a seed in the room. You create a story in which land ownership can always be questioned. You create a story in which displacement becomes a kind of recurring pattern, something the locals were supposedly doing all on their own long before any colonizer arrived. You plant doubt. And in colonial history, doubt has always been a very useful tool. The problem is that the second story was never true. It was almost certainly never true, even when people first told it. And now that thanks to scientific tools that did not exist 100 years ago, we finally know the truth. And when the first wave of ancient DNA labs began pulling genetic material out of old bones, out of burial sites, out of archaeological digs, story was never true. It was almost certainly never true, even when people first told it. And now, thanks to scientific tools that did not exist 100 years ago, we finally know the truth. When the first wave of ancient DNA labs began pulling genetic material out of old bones, out of burial sites, out of archaeological digs, scattered across the Pacific, something unexpected started to surface. Not just answers to old questions, but an entirely new way to test stories that had been locked in place for many generations. Bones do not have a political position. DNA does not have a colonizing agenda. Teeth and burial sites do not choose sides in a land dispute. They simply hold information. And once that information was finally read, the older story did not survive. The first genetic clue came from sample after sample taken from Maori communities across New Agenda. Teeth and burial sites do not choose sides in a land dispute. They simply hold information. And once that information was finally read, the older story did not survive. The first genetic clue came from sample after sample taken from Maori communities across New Zealand. The data lined up almost perfectly with what is now a well-supported model of human migration out of Taiwan, sometimes called the Austronesian expansion, which began somewhere around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. It sounds almost unbelievable when you first say it, but modern genetic evidence now traces the deep ancestry of the Maori, and indeed of Polynesians more broadly, back to a small group of farming and seafaring communities on the island of Taiwan. From there, their descendants moved. Slowly, in waves, generation by generation, they moved south through the Philippines, into parts of island Southeast Asia, and then out into the open water of the Pacific. People sometimes call this particular route the Lapita Cultural Complex. You will not need to remember the name. What you do need to remember is the scale. We are talking about the largest human maritime expansion in the history of our species. We are talking about people who, without satellite navigation, without compasses, as we know them today, without metal, without a printed map of any kind, set out across one of the largest oceans on Earth and kept going. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine being part of a community that decides, after thousands of years of living comfortably in one place, that the next horizon is worth chasing. Imagine setting out in a hand-built canoe with your family, with your food stores, with your sacred carvings, with nothing but the stars at night, the shape of the swell during the day, the flight path of certain birds, the color of the ocean itself, and the memory of elders who had already made parts of the journey before you. There were no engines to fall back on. There was no rescue ship coming if you missed your target island by 50 miles. There was only inherited knowledge passed down through voice, song, and ritual, and the trust that it was enough. And it was. Within roughly 1,000 years, their descendants had reached Samoa, Tonga, and what we now call the heart of West and East Polynesia. Islands like Tahiti, islands in the Cook Chain, islands in the Marquesas. And from there, the final chapter of that long journey began to write itself. Somewhere around the year 1300 AD, a small fleet of these voyagers sailed south into colder water than their ancestors had ever faced, and spotted land that no human being had ever set foot on. New Zealand, green, mountainous, heavily forested, surrounded by cold ocean, the largest habitable landmass in the entire Pacific. And the people who stepped off those canoes became, eventually, the ancestors of the Maori. That part of the story is not speculation. It is not colonial folklore. It is supported layer after layer by archaeology, by carbon dating, by ancient DNA recovered from old settlement sites, and by something that colonial-era historians took far too long to respect: Maori oral tradition. For generations, Maori communities preserved their origin stories in carefully structured forms. Some are called korero tuku iho, inherited narratives. Some take the shape of wakapapa, layered genealogies. Some are taught through the naming and retelling of specific waka, the ancestral canoes. These are not vague legends told around an evening fire. They are deeply structured records. Names of ancestors, names of canoes, names of specific islands, dates of departure and arrival, generations clearly mapped. They are consistent across many separate tribal lines. For a long time, outside historians treated these traditions as colorful folklore. They said things like it was interesting, but not really history. They said it could not be independently verified. They said it was not the kind of evidence a real academic study could lean on. And yet when geneticists finally ran the DNA data alongside the oral record, something extraordinary happened. The two matched. The travel routes described in oral history lined up with the genetic clusters found in modern and ancient populations. The names of canoes lined up with regional genetic differences still visible today. The stories that had been dismissed as myth turned out to be one of the most accurate long-distance human migration records on the planet. We are talking about oral traditions preserved across more than 30 generations with no written language to back them up, matching the DNA evidence almost point for point. That is not luck. That is memory operating at a level of precision most modern institutions struggle to match. And right here, somewhere around the 1,500 word mark of this video, I want to ask you something a little different from what we have been talking about. Pause for a second and quietly ask yourself this. What story from your own family have you assumed was exaggerated, when maybe it was quietly carrying more truth than you realized? Hold that question in your chest as we keep going. You might need it later. Now, tap that subscribe button if you have not already, because the next part of this story is where everything starts to crack in a way most people were never told about. Now let us pull the camera back in and look directly at the Moriori story, because this is where the older colonial narrative truly falls apart under its own weight. The Moriori are a real, living community. They are not a myth. They are not a museum exhibit. They live today, deeply connected to the Chatham Islands, with rich ancestral links to that remote archipelago. For many years, the popular stories had something deeply cruel about them, It said the Moriori were the original inhabitants of mainland New Zealand. It said they were a more peaceful, more passive people who had been almost entirely wiped out by the Maori when those first canoes came ashore. It said the Maori had committed something close to genocide against an earlier, gentler race. That story was taught to generations of New Zealand children in school textbooks. It was used in courtroom arguments. It shaped public memory. It shaped national guilt. And it was never actually supported by the bones themselves. When geneticists and archaeologists finally looked carefully at the Moriori, what they found was something quite different from the textbook version. The Moriori are Polynesian. Their DNA ties them to the same broad Austronesian voyaging tradition that gave rise to the Maori in the first place. Their ancestors did not come first to New Zealand at all. Their ancestors came to the Chatham Islands from the New Zealand mainland, and quite possibly also directly from East Polynesia, sometime around the year 1500 AD, give or take, a generation or two depending on which line of evidence you emphasize. They were not a separate older race. They were relatives. They sailed from the same cultural network. They spoke a related language. They carried shared knowledge of navigation, song, ritual, carving, and genealogy. Over centuries of isolation on those wind-blasted islands, their dialect shifted, their customs evolved along their own unique path, and their community developed its own distinct identity. But the bones told a clear story when they were finally tested. There was no mysterious, vanished race. There was no pre-Maori conquest of one Polynesian group by another on the mainland. There was one long, branching Polynesian voyaging story, splitting in different directions, adapting to different environments, and surviving in different ways. And this is the part that carries weight for more people than just historians. The Moriori also developed something extraordinary of their own on those islands, a peace code, a formal social agreement known today as Nunuku Wenua, a binding rule that blood feuds and lethal conflict were no longer acceptable ways to resolve disagreement, no matter the provocation. That is not the move of a passive, defeated people. That is the move of a community sophisticated enough to consciously choose nonviolence, even when surrounded by pressures that would normally have rewarded violence. To this day, Moriori scholars and descendants emphasize that this code is not a relic. It is inheritance. It shaped how their ancestors survived centuries of isolation and hardship, and it still shapes how they think about justice today. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Imagine being a Moriori person. Imagine growing up hearing your family history described as a lost, doomed, defeated race that got wiped out. Imagine knowing your grandmother's stories, knowing your great-grandfather's name, knowing the waka your people sailed on, and yet having outside experts insist with absolute confidence that you were a footnote, that your whole lineage was a mistake, that your moment on this planet was just the victim section of someone else's story. Now imagine what it feels like to have ancient DNA quietly reveal that the experts were wrong and your family's memory was right. There is no dramatic ending needed to make that powerful. The science answered. The dignity simply returned. And here is the part that still sends a chill down the spine of any serious historian. That false pre-Maori story did not survive on accident. It survived because it was useful. It was useful to a colonial government that wanted to soften its own conduct by pointing to a supposed earlier wave of conquest. It was useful to a legal system that wanted to muddy questions of land ownership. It was useful to a settler society that wanted a moral cushion to sit on. The myth did not die because it was bad history. It died because DNA finally made bad history impossible to defend in good faith. We are now living in the era where political convenience, no matter how long it has been printed, is no longer a match for a properly tested bone. And once you accept that, a lot of other old stories around the world start to look a lot less sturdy than we were taught. Now here is where the script gets even more interesting, because the genetic trail from this same voyaging tradition did not stop at New Zealand. It reaches all the way to South America. And this is the part that most old school history books never even dream of including. For a very long time, the standard Pacific narrative went something like this. Polynesian voyagers lived in their own ocean. They were brilliant sailors, but they were isolated. They went island to island inside a familiar triangle. Hawaii in the north, New Zealand in the southwest. Easter Island, known locally as Rapa Nui, in the east. Outside of that triangle, they had no real contact with anyone. They certainly did not run into South America, and South Americans certainly did not find them. The triangle story was taught as gospel for many decades. It showed up in atlases, it showed up in documentaries, it was repeated on almost every classroom wall that contained a map of the Pacific. But there has always been one small, stubborn clue that refused to fit the model: the sweet potato. The sweet potato, which we now call kumara across much of Polynesia, is originally a South American plant. It was domesticated in the Peru-Ecuador region thousands of years ago. Geographically, there is no gentle drift story on Earth that explains how it ends up sitting in gardens across the central Pacific long before any European ship ever appears in those waters. No birds were carrying viable cuttings across thousands of miles of cold, open ocean. No floating debris was moving intact root crops that far. There is no natural pathway that is honest about the math of distance, current, and salt. Something happened, something human. Earlier explanations tried to wave it away. Some scientists suggested seeds drifted across the ocean. Some proposed accidental transmission by storm, by bird, by sheer accident. But genetic testing of sweet potato varieties across Polynesia and South America increasingly says the same thing. There was deliberate transfer. That transfer happened before Europeans ever made the trip. If you combine that plant evidence with newer genetic studies of ancient and modern human remains across Polynesia, the picture gets even more interesting. Some studies have identified small traces of ancestry connected to indigenous South American populations appearing within Polynesian genetic lines. Not a flood of people, not a colonization event, just faint signals of contact. The kind of signal you get from a small group arriving in canoes, mixing in over a few generations, and being almost completely absorbed into the local population over time. Some research teams are still debating the exact timing and the exact route. That is healthy. That is exactly how science is supposed to work. But the underlying point is becoming very hard to ignore. Polynesian voyagers, ancestors of the same cultural tradition that eventually reached New Zealand, very likely crossed thousands of miles of open ocean to reach South America at a time when history books said nobody could possibly have done that. And if you want to know how staggering that really is, hold this next sentence in your chest for a second. If even one of those journeys is real, then Polynesian navigators reached a continent on the other side of the Pacific centuries before Columbus ever set sail. We are not talking about a trip across a calm lake. We are talking about a return journey from across the widest ocean on Earth, with no engine, by starlight alone into prevailing winds and unknown currents, and then back home again. That is not a story about primitive people stumbling onto islands by accident. That is a story about the most extraordinary, deep-water navigators in human history, and we owe them a much more honest version of their past than the one we were given. Now, somewhere around the 3,000 word mark, I want to take a moment and ask you directly, if this story has made you rethink anything at all, even a small detail, do me a genuine favor right now. Take 10 seconds and text the name of one person in your contacts who really needs to hear this. Just one. Send them the link, tell them to watch until the end. Because the only way old stories, like the colonial one, we just broke apart finally die for good, is when people pass the truth forward. Be the person who breaks the chain in your circle tonight. Now, there is a really important thing we have to do here, and it is the part that often gets ignored in videos like this one. We have to bring the story back to the people, not the dates, not the migration models, the actual human beings who are alive right now and living with the consequences of these old stories every day. For decades, many Maori communities were told that their waka papa, their genealogies, their waka stories, their careful knowledge of who came from where and when was not real history. They were told it was colorful. They were told it was symbolic. They were told it did not measure up to the standards of written colonial record keeping. And yet, when the geneticists came in and finally did their work, they did not replace those oral traditions. They confirmed them. They lined up with them. The names carried in memory, the canoes named in chant, the islands called out in ancient song, almost all of it matched what the bones and the molecules were saying independently. That is not a small thing. That is vindication. That is a quiet, almost ceremonial return of respect to a tradition of knowledge that was dismissed for over 100 years by people who had never earned the right to dismiss it. And here is where it gets emotional in a way that very few science videos ever get. Imagine you are part of a community whose ancestors were told their stories were myth, who were told that outsiders knew better, who felt the slow erosion of confidence that comes from being told your family memory is wrong. Now imagine that modern science eventually walks in and says, very plainly, no, your family memory was right down to details other scholars did not even bother to look for. Imagine how that feels. Not pride in a flashy way, just a deep, quiet kind of relief. The kind that you do not need to announce, the kind that simply loosens something that has been sitting in your chest for generations. There is something else worth saying here too, and it extends well beyond New Zealand. This is not only about the Maori. This is not only about the Moriori. This is about a pattern that has shown up all over the world. Indigenous communities whose histories were written by outside powers, whose origins were described by people who arrived long after them, whose oral traditions were dismissed because they did not look like a European footnote. Ancient DNA is quietly rewriting those footnotes, one community at a time. And it is doing something that words alone could not. It is taking questions about who was telling the truth and moving them out of the realm of debate and into the realm of evidence. That is not just an academic shift. That is a moral shift in how we understand history itself. And that matters for the present, not just the past. When false stories like the pre-Maori myth shaped land policy, shaped treaty negotiations, shaped how entire populations were treated, the harm was not abstract. It was concrete. It affected who got respected in courtrooms. It affected who got believed by officials. It affected which communities had their claims taken seriously and which got quietly sidelined. The reason this kind of science matters so much today is not because we want a museum display. It is because the stories we tell ourselves about who belongs where and why are still being used to make real decisions about real land and real lives. Let's zoom out for one final wide shot of this whole story before we close. New Zealand is one of the last major land masses on Earth to be reached by humans. While much of the world was already inhabited for many thousands of years, the islands of Aotearoa sat empty, untouched, covered in forest and bird life that had evolved without any mammalian predators at all. That means the entire Maori story, while rich and deep and full of extraordinary cultural achievement, is still a relatively recent chapter in the longer human journey. But what a chapter it is! Within just a few centuries, the ancestors of the Maori transformed that land completely. They built layered oral systems that preserved extraordinary detail across many generations. They created sophisticated carving traditions, weaving traditions, and architecture. They developed their own science of navigation, agriculture, meteorology, diplomacy, warfare, and storytelling. They did not become a simple society because they were new to the land. They became a complex, demanding, highly structured civilization because of who they were. And when we talk about the Moriori on the Chatham Islands, the same is true in a different key. They took the same voyaging knowledge, the same broad Polynesian toolkit, and adapted it to one of the harshest environments in the entire Pacific. They built their own peace-based social code. They created their own unique cultural forms. They survived centuries of isolation that would have broken many other communities. They were not a side note in someone else's story. They were a Polynesian success story in their own right. And we owe them a story without the colonial fog still floating above it. So here is the part I really want you to sit with as we close. The Maori were never who many of us were told they were. Not because they were smaller than we thought, not because they were less. The opposite. They were exactly what their ancestors and their oral traditions always said they were. Skilled, deliberate, deeply rooted, and connected to one of the most extraordinary human migrations in the entire history of our species. The DNA did not rewrite their story. It stripped away a foreign layer that had been sitting on top of it. It cleaned off a coat of paint that did not belong. And what is left underneath is something older, something stronger, and something far more honest than anything a colonial textbook ever dared to publish. And maybe that is the deeper reminder we should walk away with tonight. History is never truly final. It is never locked in place just because enough people have repeated a version of it for a long time. It can be corrected. It can be challenged. It can be restored, especially when new tools let us look closer at the evidence our ancestors quietly left behind. Sometimes the story we were told was the small one, and sometimes the real one was always waiting patiently in the bones, in the chants, in the Waka records, for the rest of us to be ready to finally listen. One last thing before we end. Right now, as this video closes, I want to ask you something personal. Pick a single word, just one. The word that captures exactly how this story made you feel. Drop it in the comments below. Vindication, relief, or evidence our ancestors quietly left behind. Sometimes the story we were told was the small one, and sometimes the real one was always waiting patiently in the bones, in the chants, in the Waka records, for the rest of us to be ready to finally listen. One last thing before we end. Right now, as the video closes, I want to ask you something personal. Pick a single word, just one. The word that captures exactly how this story made you feel. Drop it in the comments below. Vindication, relief, anger, curiosity, anything honest. We are going to read every single one of them. And if it made you think of someone who still trusts the old version of this story, send this video to them tonight. Because some truths do not only belong to the past, they belong to the people we love right now, who deserve to finally know what was really buried in the bones all along. If you made it all the way to the final line of this video, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is built for. Hit subscribe, tap the bell, and let us know in the comments which ancient story you want us to pull apart next. Because the truth is far from over, and we have barely scratched the surface.